Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the next webinar of Edukacja Filozoficzna, Journal on Philosophical Education. Today, special topic, and our managing editor, Filip Łapiński, will introduce us to this topic of today's webinar. Filip, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marcin. So I just wanted to say a few words at the beginning of the webinar about the progress that we've made while creating and preparing the issues, no longer an issue, but two issues about the philosophical education in Lvov-Warsaw School. So we've published the call for papers to inviting authors to send their submissions on the topic. I think Lvov-Warsaw School may be the most important philosophical school in the history of Polish thought in the field of philosophy. We've published the call for papers in 2023 on our website. And since then, it has been steadily gaining more and more attention. So we've been receiving articles and other texts throughout all this time. And the final number of articles and other texts, and some of them have arrived very recently, since we've agreed to receive some texts even late. We wanted to give the topic the attention it really deserves. And we also wanted to talk about the Lvov-Warsaw School exhaustively. So all of that exceeded our earlier expectations and made it effectively impossible to publish everything in one volume. Because to sum up, we have received 13 articles. Almost all of them successfully went through peer review process, and also decided to include many other texts, not just introduction, obviously, or numerous memories of Lvov-Warsaw School members on Kazimierz Twardowski, Władysław Tatarkiewicz, Izydora Dąbska, or Czesław Lejewski. It was more than 20 distinct shorter texts written by different authors on these Lvov-Warsaw School members, more than 20. So that's a lot. But also 3 historical texts on philosophical education written by Kazimierz Twardowski himself. It was a draft of high school philosophy curriculum guidelines of Polish Philosophical Society, or the essay on the role of philosophy in high school in general. And to this, we've also added a report written by Marek Porwolik, who is present here, a report on teaching logic nowadays, translation of Piotr Kostyło's article on the pedagogical dimension of the critique against irrationalism in the school, in the Lvov-Warsaw School, and this translation has never been published in English before, and also the memory of an acclaimed Polish philosopher, Jan Woleński, about writing his own book on the school. So together, as you see, it would be impossible to pack all of this into one volume. We have decided to divide the content into 2 parts. The first one will be entirely in English, and it will be consisting of texts we have received earlier. Some of them we have presented during the last 2 webinars. All of these texts are very close to being published. We will publish the volume in the beginning of May. So watch out for the information on our website and social media. And the second part, I will just present it shortly, consisting of 6 English and Polish articles, 11 memories, 1 historical text of Kazimierz Twardowski, and translation of Kostyło's article. It's all in the process of being prepared. In some cases, the articles are still in peer review. Some of them are already accepted, and it will be published a little later, probably in late summer. And the other articles in the second issue, because this is the 3rd webinar of ours, but so far the previous 2 webinars referred to the articles from the 1st volume. And now we have the 1st webinar about the 2nd volume. Some of these articles will include, for example, the analysis of the school logic, according to Kotarbiński's philosophy of upbringing, Józef Bocheński's thought on patriotism and patriotic upbringing, or Polish experience of ethical education conducted outside of schools. So as you see, it will expand the topic very interestingly. So I think it's worth waiting for. It's worth waiting for the 2nd issue on the topic of philosophical education in Lvov-Warsaw School. And in previous webinars, we've presented quite a lot of articles, but now we wanted to show you the ideas standing behind these articles that are still in development. We have chosen 2 of them. One has been written by our issue editor, Professor Anna Brożek, and the other has been prepared by Professor Paweł Polak and Ewelina Grądzka. The latter, Ewelina Grądzka, also our issue editor, has managed to connect with us, even though there are some difficulties with connection, but I hope that she will be able to present just in a moment. And then we will have the presentation of Anna Brożek. We have decided to switch these two presentations to allow Ewelina to present, because it may be more difficult for her to present later. I don't know whether she will be able to answer our questions if we have them, but even if she doesn't, I recommend and I encourage you to write down the thoughts of yours during the presentation. Even if Ewelina is forced to disconnect, you can ask these questions. I will write them down. I will send them to the author, and then the author will be able to send her responses to you after the webinar. And then we will have the presentation of Professor Anna Brożek. And then I encourage you to ask your questions during the webinar. I hope for a fruitful discussion, especially since I believe that the content of the article, the philosophical education during the war, will make us very interested in the topic. I think both philosophically and historically minded listeners will surely find a lot of interesting details in the content of the article. So do not hesitate to ask your questions. But now, dear Ewelina, if you are there, the floor is yours. I encourage you to give your presentation on the topic of your article. Thank you.
Filip, I'm sorry, can you start with Professor Brożek, because I still need a few minutes to send you the presentation.
Sure. So
Okay,
maybe I will just ask, because here there is also one of the authors from the second issue, Maciej Wołkow, and maybe if Maciej, if you are there, maybe you would like to say just a few sentences. Obviously, it's not a presentation we agreed on, but if you want, you can just say 1 or 2 or 3 sentences about the things that you've been working on. I may just hint that the article about the philosophy of upbringing of Tadeusz Kotarbiński has been written by Maciej Wołkow. And I see also the message of Ewelina that maybe it will be easier for her to have the Anna Brożek's presentation first. So maybe Anya, if you're ready, then we can switch the order into the original one.
Okay. So so I will start. Let me share my screen with you. I hope that you can see my slides. And let me know if the slides are changing. Can you see the slides changing? Okay, great. So thanks very much for this opportunity, and thank you very much to the editor staffs of Edukacja Filozoficzna for all your effort. I'm really satisfied with our collaboration, with our cooperation in preparing this volume. It's something really great, and these 2 volumes, which will be soon published, is something I dreamed for, because the problem of philosophical education in the Lvov-Warsaw School is one of the dearest subjects for me. And my article concerns just one short aspect, but important aspect of philosophical education in the Lvov-Warsaw School, namely the education during the Second World War, clandestine education. It was a kind of struggle for survival by members of the Lvov-Warsaw School, who suffered really tragic difficulties during the war, during the occupation, and still resisted and survived and tried to continue their teaching duties and their scientific work during the war. There were few steps of my way to this subject. Let me just mention them. So I will start from some short biographical remarks, and then I will move to the short presentation of the content of my paper. It all started in February 2022, when I was invited by Professor Friedrich Stadler from University of Vienna, from the Vienna Circle Institute in Vienna, to cooperate in preparation an exhibition about the Vienna Circle in the 30s, during how they called it, demented times. Hitler was in power in in Germany, and there was an Anschluss of Austria, and it was in fact the end of the Vienna Circle, and we prepared an additional component of this exhibition here in Warsaw, in University of Warsaw Library, where we presented what happened during that time in the Lvov-Warsaw School. The exhibition took place in the beginning of 2022, from January to February. And there is also a film about this exhibition available on YouTube, so you can watch the exhibition through this film and my short presentation of this exhibition. There's a link here available. But can you see the date? It's a significant date because during the exhibition about this demented time, the time of terror of two ideologies which influenced so much the history of Europe, during that time another tragic event occurred, namely Russia attacked Ukraine. And in this film, which was made just few days after the invasion, I talked about that about this problem and about that this tragic times are active once again. Once again, there is a terror in Europe, and that we still live in the demented times. And it was the beginning of my work into the problem of war in philosophy, attitude of philosophers towards the war. Then the same year in October, we made a discussion with Ukrainian scholars. It was a discussion, a panel online about moral intuitions towards the war. It was also a great event and another step towards this problem of philosophy against the war and tragic events of the war. And then 1 year later, I was invited by Professor Igor Kalivets from the University of Lviv Polytechnics, one of my closest friends from Ukraine, to present 5 lectures, a cycle of lectures on the Lvov-Warsaw School and war. It was just, he asked me to say something about what did the philosophers during the war in order to help them in Ukraine to, just start to believe that life is still possible also during the war and also after the war. And these lectures were divided into 5 pieces. At first, I started from presenting these periods of existence of the Lvov-Warsaw School during the peace, when the school developed freely and successfully, and during the war, when it was destroyed. Then I presented the struggle to preserve the continuity of the school and the organization and significance of the underground education. Then the scholarly work under wartime conditions, then the wartime fates of selected philosophers from the Lvov-Warsaw School, and finally I focused on the ethics of the Lvov-Warsaw School in the face of war. These lectures are also available in internet. And my fourth step, the fourth step to this problem, to this subject of the Lvov-Warsaw School and the war is one of our previous webinars. And Ewelina Grądzka, who mentioned that unfortunately there is no English paper available on the problem of the Lvov-Warsaw School and secret education during the war. And I thought, well, I have so many documents completed about the subject. Perhaps it's the best occasion to write about it. And that's why I decided, so thank you, Ewelina, for this encouragement. It was a really important impulse for me to finish this article. Okay, and now shortly about the content of it. The questions I posted and I tried to answer are as follows. What were the actual losses of the Lvov-Warsaw School as a result of the Second World War? How did members of the Lvov-Warsaw School behave in face of war? How did they try to maintain the continuity of the school? What was the attitude of the members of the school towards academic work during the war? Did wartime conditions influence the subjects of their work? What were the personal fates of scholars associated with the Lvov-Warsaw School, both those who died and those who survived? What are the ethical views of philosophers from the Lvov-Warsaw School circle? on the subject of war, and what ethical dilemmas did the Lvov-Warsaw School members actually face, and what choices did they make in face of war. The content of my article is as follows. I start from short introduction that then I present the state of the Lvov-Warsaw School before September 1939. To say shortly, it was in flourishing state, and unfortunately all of that was destroyed because of the war. Then I focus on human and institutional losses by Polish scientific philosophy between 1939 and 1945. Then I presented the Polish resistance movement and the participation of the Lvov School's members in it. In the paragraphs 5 to 7, I focus on the most important subject of the article, namely on the problem of secret philosophical education in Warsaw, Lvov, Vilna, and on scientific philosophical work, philosophical research during the war, and I end with some assessments and comments. Today, of course, I'm not able to present all the content, but I will focus on some of them, and I will just shortly present what are my findings about these issues, and for more details, you have to read my article, let's say. Yeah, what was the scale? What was the factual loss of the Lvov-Warsaw School in comparison to general war losses of Polish state? Well, Poland suffered devastating human losses during the World War II. About 6 million citizens died, half of them of Jewish origin, but still they were Polish citizens. Then the intelligentsia was especially targeted, as you know. Roughly 1/3 of Polish professionals, teachers, priests, scientists, and philosophers were killed. Operations like Intelligenzaktion, Sonderaktion Krakow by the Nazis and the Katyn massacre by the Soviets exemplify this intent to destroy the intellectual class. Schools were closed to Sovietized, and education beyond the basic levels was often punishable by death. And also in the Lvov-Warsaw School, it lost about 1/3 of members. About 50 members of the school died during the war. And it happened during the 1939 invasion, Nazi persecutions, the Warsaw Uprising. Some of them committed suicide, others were murdered or died in exile. The war's trauma left lasting scars on survivors and decimated the institution's potential. Many scholars forced into exile could no longer enrich post-war Polish philosophy. What was the reaction of Polish society and the members of the school after Poland was captured from west by the Nazis and from east by the Soviets? Well, as you know, after the invasion, the Polish undergrad state was formed. It operated both military, like a home army, of course, and civilly, including secret cults, welfare, and clandestine education. What was the scale of this education? Well, some numbers can say something about it. By 1943, thousands of teachers taught about 90,000 students in secret, despite the risk of arrest or death. Members of the Warsaw schools played key roles in both branches of underground state. So they all participated both in the army and in the education, of course. Many of them engaged in underground teaching while also joining military efforts like Józef Maria Bocheński, Alicja Iwańska, Józefina Melberg, who helped rescue prisoners from Majdanek. Several participated in the Warsaw Uprising. When philosophers, soldiers died during this uprising. This generation's loss was deeply felt in post-war Polish philosophy. Members of the Warsaw School also participated in the rescue of Jews. Organizations like Żegota, supported by philosophers such as Ossowski and Słupecki, coordinated despite the lethal consequences. And in Vilna also Czerzowski helped independently and was later recognized as writers among the nations. And now what happened in Warsaw? Well, Warsaw became the center of the most extensive secret education network in the occupied Poland. despite several conditions such as street terror, curfews, and ethnic segregation. Members of the Warsaw School and other academics continued their teaching efforts, driven by a strong sense of purpose and ethical commitment. In Warsaw, two underground universities operated, University of Warsaw and University of Western Lands, which was relocated from Poznań, because in Poznań everyone were killed and everything completely was closed, everything that was Polish before the war. A deep sense of solidarity formed among students and teachers who resisted despair by engaging in intellectual pursuits. Key members of this secret education, such as Kotarbiński, Osowska, Tatarkiewicz, Łukasiewicz, resumed their work in underground education, often assisted by younger scholars and former students. Classes were held in private homes, in small groups, and conducted in secret. Kotarbiński, for instance, recalled teaching logic and supporting his assistant Henryk Hisz, while Maria Osowska played a pivotal role in organizing philosophy instruction. Despite wartime limitations, 5 students during the war completed master's degrees under the supervision of the Lvov-Warsaw School members, and many others finished their studies, receiving degrees after the war. No doctorates were awarded, but, for instance, one habilitation colloquium took place. It was Zwierzawski's habilitation colloquium during the war. Several notable underground seminars operated during the war. The most famous were Łukasiewicz and Krokiewicz seminar, Kotarbiński's logic seminar, his praxological seminar. There were also his so-called logic group, later known as Warsaw Logical Club, which functioned during the war. Tatarkiewicz Monday seminar, and so on. We may list also other similar meetings. And despite the circumstances, the Lvov-Warsaw School members upheld academic standards, moral ideas, making undergrad education a form of resistance and hope. What happened in Lvov? Well, of course, Lvov was at first occupied by the Soviets and only from 1949 by the Germans. Januk Kazimierz University, so the cradle of the Lvov-Warsaw School, which is so important from emotional point of view, but also institutional point of view to all members of the school, it was closed, and instead the Ivan Franko University, Ukrainian University, but in fact Sovietist, Marxist-Leninist university was opened there. Philosophy departments were, of course, abolished. Edukiewicz and Ingarden could lecture, but not philosophy. Underground philosophy teaching, of course, was organized. Sorry for this mistake. Of course, it's not Izabela, but Izydora Domska and Fryderyka Jerzempińska were the most important people that organized this secret education. What happened in Vilno? Initially occupied, it was, of course, just like in Lvov, occupied by Soviets, then by Lithuanian, and then by Germans. Stefan Batory University operated only until 1939 December. Later, there was secret teaching. The most important person in Vilno was Tadeusz Czyżowski, who led undergrad philosophy instruction. He also held the meetings of philosophical society. About 150 secret meetings took place. It was, I think, as far as I know, the only philosophical society which functioned so actively during the war. Okay, so in order to not to talk too much, let me summarize and make a short evaluation. To summarize, despite wartime oppression, both teachers and students recalled the undergrad education period as a time of exceptional cooperation and friendship formed through shared hardship. No one was forced to study, but everyone wanted to study to survive, to help the Polish culture to survive, to help philosophy, free philosophy to survive. Unprecedented freedom in teaching and learning. It was expressed and it was emphasized by many members that this education was really free, despite this terror which happened on the streets. No ideological censorship allowed full academic freedom. undergrad education provided intellectual stimulation, escape from war reality, and sense of purpose and hope for a better future. But, for instance, the significance of the Warsaw Uprising was something important here. Usually, the people who survived were convinced that it was really destroying. Of course, we may be proud by the decision that this uprising started, and for these people it was obvious that they have to fight, but the losses were just terrible for Warsaw, for Poles, and also for philosophy. So this destructive impact of the Warsaw Uprising, the uprising caused massive destruction of cultural, scientific, and organizational achievements of the undergrad state. So imagine, for instance, Tatarkiewicz lost all his students, all his great students, talented students, which he helped during the war to survive, to continue their work, and all of them were killed during the uprising and in other circumstances. So it led to death of many educated individuals, undermining the gains of secret education. Unfortunately, after the war, because of the Yalta's decisions, Poland lost Lvov and Vilna as intellectual centers. And in Poland, there was Sovietization of Polish intellectual and spiritual life. Free philosophy was suppressed, only Marxism-Leninism was permitted. Twardowski's disciples were labeled as ideological enemies. During the Stalinist era, philosophers had to choose between abandoning philosophy and limiting themselves to logic. Some figures from the Lvov-Warsaw School were temporarily expelled from universities. But from this perspective, we may say that this effort to continue the activity of the Lvov-Warsaw School, to continue education in philosophy, to fight for freedom of thought, was really so important. I think it would be much difficult to survive ideological pressure if the philosophical education was not continued during the war. So nonetheless, the spirit and legacy of the Warsaw School survived, carried on by those who endured both wartime and post-war oppression. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions?
Survived, really, the spirit of the school survived at least, and they tried to rebuild after the war.
Okay, thank you. So if we do not have any other questions, then Ewelina, if you're here, then you could make your presentation.
Yes.
Hello.
Hello, can you hear me? Good afternoon. I'm terribly sorry for the situation. Just trains were delayed, hopefully. I managed to get off on one of the stations and I'm hidden in a shopping mall. So I hope nobody gonna disturb us, but I'm gonna turn off the camera for this. And I'm just gonna explain you about the article. So Filip, if you could help me with the presentation I sent you. And I wanted to thank you, Ms. Brożek, for putting my picture and remembering the beginnings of our collaboration on this issue. It is a great adventure, intellectual adventure for me. Co-editing the issue, writing the articles, and especially with my supervisor, it's a lot of intellectual progress for me. And also this presentations here are also something innovative. So I'm very glad this is much bigger than I expected in the beginning. Okay, so as Filip mentioned already, this is the second issue, and this is also a second article that also was a consequence of writing the first one, and it turned out that the material we gathered is much bigger, and it requires a separate paper. fortunately or unfortunately, this paper turned out to be also large. It's about 40 pages. But I think it is important to summarize the discussion because it is not available in English, as Professor mentioned. And I am part of the international community of practitioners of philosophy. And I hear a lot of discussion, and I just regretted that they don't know that there was something like that in Poland. And I even regret that we should have a publication in Polish because I don't think it is easily available. So the paper we prepared and entitled is Philosophy for Modernizing and Strengthening Polish Society, Kazimierz Twardowski's contribution to the discussion on the development of propadeutics of philosophy. And as you can see from the title, we consider that philosophy and this discussion about propadeutics and having it in school was especially for Twardowski and members of the Lvov-Warsaw School considered important aspect of modernization, especially after we regained independence and strengthening Polish society. They really believed that philosophy can play a crucial part. And this is something regrettable that we cannot very strongly get through this message nowadays. So maybe this is gonna somehow help. Okay, thank you. Can you switch? So the plan of the paper is in the first part, we present the discussion on philosophical propadeutics in Polish education before World War in general. In the second part, we present the discussion in Galicia at the beginning of the 20th century when Poland was still divided into partitions and didn't exist as a separate country. Then the third part is a discussion in reborn Poland, and it's in the very beginning of this period. And then the last period that is of interest to us is the mid-1920s until mid-30s discussion. Can you switch? So some general aspects of the discussions we presented. Can you switch? So as it was also in the beginning mentioned, there were these three moments of the discussion, which is also interesting that it is a longer process and process that continued, and especially interesting that Twardowski participated in all these three moments of the discussion. His role was changing, but he was part of that. So it is also important heritage of Twardowski that he through the whole academic career was involved not only in academic issues but also in pre-college education. So the first discussion was provoked by the Austria-Hungary reform of education in in the beginning of the 20th century, 1900. This was a reform of the program that already existed because the propadeutics was introduced in 1848, but it was not fulfilled the requirements, the instructions. So there were reforms continuing, and one of them was this one. What is maybe optimistic is that the whole empire had the problem. So it's not like it was running everywhere perfectly, but there were issues with the implementation of the program. And the second one, as I mentioned, was just after we regained independence, and that was a very pivotal moment when the system was we had to create a new system, educational system, and it was a moment to decide whether we should have propadeutics of philosophy in the curriculum, and Twardowski was one of the strongest supporters. And this is and the paper, our paper is kind of a explanation to this Twardowski's article that we translated into English. And this is this paper from this beginning of the second discussion. So Twardowski's paper is very I would say apologetic. He is speaking in favor of philosophical education and its importance. And it is, I think this is very emotional, and it is a little bit like a statement of his ideas, very clear. He never later or before stated them that clearly. And I think very emotionally, I mean, in this positive sense, that you can see that this topic was sensitive for him. And he had a very developed vision of why teaching philosophy is important, how much good it can give. And I think we can keep using the same argumentation as he did. So I really recommend reading this translation. And then was a second discussion in the Reborn Poland, third one here, starting in the mid-20s, because of the disappointment and different expectations toward the program. The spoiler or something we presented in the first article is that the program that was criticized in this third part of the discussion was really Twardowski's program. So generally he was the source of criticism, but he was also maybe not disappointed, but unsatisfied with this, because this program he considered very narrow because of the very few hours. I mean, few for Twardowski meant 3 hours, which of course for today is a lot, because we have only 1 hour, and this is faculty subject, so it's something unimaginable nowadays to have 3 hours of philosophy. Okay, if you could switch, please. So also interesting for us from this historical perspective and from research perspective is that there were scientific journals that engaged. So I'm very glad that Edukacja Filozoficzna is hosting us with this subject, but generally I don't think other journals would be that interested. And here we can see that the top Polish philosophical journals, of course there were only 2, or maybe not only 2, but there were more, but generally these were the top. They were engaged in this discussion. And real philosophers, I mean, not educational philosophers, not departments of pedagogy, which is now considered the place where we should discuss that, we're doing it, but really prestigious journals. Also, one of the journals that was engaged is Museum, which was a journal strictly for high school teachers. So it is, of course, understandable, but also Philosophical Review, Przegląd Filozoficzny, started by Werycho, and Philosophical Movement, Ruch Filozoficzny, started by Twardowski. And I think it's also a sign how important the subject was, and even the fact that very often the articles were published, especially of Twardowski, were published on the front page. So they were considered, of top priority. If you can switch, please. And also the interesting is the amount of participants in this discussion. And as you can see, most of them belong to the Lvov-Warsaw School, but there were also others, which is also interesting because it means that there was a competition. But anyway, the Lvov-Warsaw School idea was winning, I would say. So except for Twardowski, there were Kazimierz Sośnicki, and also they did not agree in everything, but mostly they agree with the basics. Like, for example, Sośnicki considered, he believed that there should be different programs from different school types, which, for example, Igel and Twardowski didn't like. There was also Stanisław Ossowski, Izydora Domska, Bogdan Zawadzki, and Salomon Igel, probably the biggest specialist in this, which we're going to mention later. Also Ignacy Halpern, who later changed the name for Myślicki, Regina Reichman Etigerowa, Helena Leleszówna, Bolesław Gowecki, Bogdan Kiszkowski, Zygmunt Czerny, and those participants of the very first discussion from Krakow, Professor Maurycy Straszewski and Reverend Aleksander Pechnik. If you could switch. Just to mention something we presented in this first article is that there were just 3 programs. 2 of them were published and became official. So this is the program from 1922, which we kind of proved that was written by Twardowski, because we found in the archives the same, almost the same program that is officially published, and this program continued until 1931, which is, as we called it, minimalistic, because it was considered not enough for many, because it was only 3 hours. And then in 1935, after these discussions and criticism, Twardowski prepared something that we would call maximalist program, but it was dedicated to 3 hours for 2 years. So in total, it was 6 hours. So it is a very, very big program, very large with material, and it covered all these issues that were asked for in this discussion, but it was not in line with the amount of hours. So this program was never published, but it was sent to the ministry. And finally, there was this program from 1937, which we find almost the same copy in the Edukiewicz archives, and some letter that is kind of pointing to that it was also prepared at least partly by Twardowski. But this program was published as temporary, so it means that the discussion was probably not over, but as Professor Brożek has just explained, we have the beginning of the Second World War next year, I mean in 1938, of course, and the discussion stopped naturally, and then after the communist regime started, there was no space for the discussion. So generally, the criticism and the whole discussion is around this program from 1922. If you could switch. Also, the consequence of this, after just to sum up all these issues, was the publication, which is also interesting, publication of finally Polish textbooks. And this is very interesting because this was a very big issue that was discussed in the discussion in 1902. So as you can see, we waited almost 36 years before we got really prepared, particularly for our program textbooks. Very long time, but maybe this is also something that gives us hope that we still have time to prepare something novel nowadays. And as you can see, Edukiewicz and Czarzowski and Gawecki and Lelesz took this also challenge to prepare. It is also again interesting because these are top philosophers who prepare the textbooks. Okay. Thank you. If you can switch. Okay, so now very briefly, I wanted to just show you which papers we considered. There is not enough time to go over all these discussion points, so I encourage you to read the paper, but we're just going to mention them. If you can switch. So, as I mentioned, there was a reform and there was new instruction. And it stimulated the discussion. So the discussion, it was a very small discussion between Twardowski generally from Lwów and with Maurycy Straszewski from Krakow. Generally, these were 2 Polish philosophers, Polish academic philosophers with chairs. And the biggest issue was that there was a failure of Rada Szkolna Krajowa, that they didn't use the opportunity to develop the subject. They didn't hire well-educated, well-prepared teachers. They didn't stimulate preparation of Polish textbook, but as you could see, it turned out a much bigger issue. They expected the subject to become Matura exam. This issue will come back later on. And there was expectation for more well-prepared teachers and more engagement of academic professors in the teachers' preparation. We can observe this movement later on. I mean, there was Twardowski's engagement, even his seminar. One of the goals of the seminar later on is to prepare teachers for propadeutics. So he took it really seriously. And in 1908, the number of hours was reduced from 4 to 3. And Twardowski was trying to convince succeeded in convincing Polish Philosophical Society to prepare a memorial to Rada Szkolna Krajowa, pointing to the negative effects of such a decision and demanding an increase in the number of hours. But it finished because then first started the First World War and everything has changed. If you could switch. So we have this first discussion in the reborn Poland. If you could switch. And as you can see, these are five publications. It's just the first one, as I mentioned, the text that we translated into English is right in the beginning of the 19th century, year 1919. As you probably know, Poland regained independence in November, so it is like publication from the beginning of the next year. So it is very fresh, and it was the front cover. Then we got a publication from Sośnicki and Ignacy Halper-Myślicki. This Myślicki's paper, I think we're going to present in a moment. And then in the 1920s, as you can see, we still have Twardowski. So really the beginnings were Twardowski's specialty, I would say. He emphasized the need to teach logic as well, and he criticized very strongly the program that the ministry prepared. Interestingly, the program was prepared by Warsaw philosophers, so Twardowski very severely criticized it, and in consequence, probably his program was accepted. If you could switch. Yes, so a few words about Sośnicki. So as I said, educative goals that were set for school was to teach, but also very interesting, especially nowadays, is that it was to be mental and character development of the pupil. So it's not only to teach, it's also develop character and mental development. Something very discutable nowadays. And the best for training in particular method of thinking was, of course, for them, propadeutics, and as a separate subject. And still the goal was to unify curriculum, because philosophy was supposed to give some unified picture of the world and of sciences. I think also very something that we probably need today. And as I mentioned, there should be different program for different school types. For example, Igel didn't agree, and Twardowski, they considered there is one type of thinking and it shouldn't be divided. If you could switch. And Halpern is interesting because what Halpern did is he made kind of a presentation, like we did a presentation of the discussion. He did a presentation of ideas of different types of propadeutics, which was also interesting to just understand that there was this idea that Twardowski had, and the members of the school was not the only one. So we could really go various directions, and anyway, Twardowski's idea dominated. And there was this theological vision that goes back as far as to the medieval ages, when philosophy was rather ancilia theologia. Then there was the systematic that was considered something against boundless philosophizing, so that there would be a systematic presentation of ideas of philosophers. problem-oriented. This was more in the direction of like Socratic method, Kant's idea about philosophy, that you can teach philosophizing, not really philosophy. And there was this historical, which was really something that we do nowadays in our program or in academia. And in first years, we just teach history of philosophy. Academic was even bigger and broader because it was really related to the whole knowledge and classification that refers to this Plato's and Aristotle's ideas of teaching, which is very big. There was logic-based education, but the problem was which logic to teach at this stage, because we started to have this modern mathematical logic, but it was considered not enough developed. So there was a discussion which logic to choose. And there was this psychology-based program. Psychology at the time was still considered part of philosophy, at least on this level of teaching. And it was supposed to unify humanistic and all the other sciences. And it was considered something like an introductory, almost like logic. And Halpern's vision was that he wanted all. So I don't know if program from 1935 was that bad. I think Halpern's vision was even larger. Okay, if you could switch, please. And finally, Twardowski, as I mentioned, on logical education. In this paper, there is demand for logical education on various levels. But he, interestingly, which is, I think, totally forgotten nowadays, is the importance of logic for the society. And he writes that what is at stake here, contrary to appearances, are needed very important things and of momentous consequence. For the lack of logical education not only lowers the intellectual level in theoretical terms, but also brings ignorance and inaccuracy into the practical application of our thoughts. And this practical application is our whole life. So it is very interesting that he could see the consequence of logical thinking and the practical life. I think it is forgotten in education, unfortunately, nowadays. If you could switch. And we have Twardowski's paper about, which is criticizing this program prepared, as I mentioned, by Warsaw philosophers. As I said, he was very frustrated about the amount of hours that were free. He was also worried that too much was left to the teachers to choose. It is also something very specific that I think Twardowski was just very person who was very grounded in the situation, and he understood that the teachers in this very beginning, they were not well prepared to decide, and it was much better to give them very straightforward instruction on what to teach and which topics to take than let them decide, especially that there was not enough time. And there was this whole issue about heuristic method that was really kind of presented like it should be instead of systematic teaching. Heuristic method was kind of a discussion, and Twardowski, at least in the beginning, was very against that. In the last publications, you can see that it is changing, probably because there were more educated people at the time, as this discussion is more than 10 years. But at that time, he was afraid that this will lead to something that he called, the people will think that they can philosophize, but they will not know the basics. This is also very interesting personally for me, because I work with philosophy for children, and there is this discussion, what are the consequences of discussing with children and not having exercises with them. So it is contemporary issue as well. And if you could switch. As I mentioned before, finally, Twardowski prepared the program that was published and that ruled, I would say, for 15 years, that frustrated the others. That's why the discussion, the next discussion started. If you could switch. Okay, and that's just a presentation of this part of the Twardowski's paper from the archive. Okay, and if you could switch here, please. So as you could see now, already we can see that there are more papers and more surnames, which shows that there was ongoing interest, which is also interesting that there were people engaged and they really wanted to change something. As you could see, almost year by year that we get a paper, but especially active moment was this 1930 with publications. So we have Czerny's presentation of the teaching in the French school, which is again interesting that they really wanted to know what happens elsewhere. And France, as it was mentioned in the beginning, the tradition we referred to was Austro-Hungarian, and really Prussian, so German tradition, let's say, German language tradition. So there was this proposal to move to the French tradition. Nowadays, we rather refer to the Anglo-Saxon traditions or Anglo-Saxon ideas. So it's also very interesting how we move around. French system until today is very spectacular because they have Matura. The last year of high school is almost fully dedicated, if not fully, to teaching philosophy. So this is really something that makes the French people philosophers until today, philosophizing in cafes and on the streets. And then we have Ossowski, Stanisław Ossowski. He really started this new discussion. Bogdan Zawadzki, that referred to his ideas, Regina Reichmann-Ettingerowa, Bolesław Gawecki. His ideas also are important because he later became the instructor for the ministry, and he was responsible for organizing teacher trainings, preparing a guideline for teachers that, if you look into the guideline, is something that was trying to keep the program Twardowski prepared, just explaining more precisely how it could be used and how it could be presented in a more attractive way. And finally, Isadora Domska, who kind of referred to the opportunity to teach logic and then ethics later on other subjects. And if you can switch. And still in 31, we have Helena Leleś. She was also this author of the textbook. And Bogdan Kieszkowski, and finally in this 34 we get this guideline, guide, maybe more, that, as I mentioned, it was prepared rather by Gawecki, who was rather in favor of Twardowski, so they until the end tried to keep the program the way it was. But as I mentioned, finally a new publication was presented in 1937. And it probably moved the discussion to another level, but we don't know how it will develop because of the outbreak of the Second World War. And if you could switch. As you can see, in 1935, we have, again, Twardowski's engagement, but it's rather on this level of preparing this new program, which was not really published, but it was sent to the ministry. And he prepared this memorial that we also translated. So I also encourage you to read it. It supposedly presents Twardowski's ideas. Probably they were also, of course, influenced by others, probably by Salomon Eagle, because if you read Salomon Eagle's papers, especially this first one, which is an entry, it was a very large entry, almost like a book, more than 30 pages. And where he really goes through all the issues in a very systematic way related to propadeutical philosophy. And one of the points is program. And if you see the points of the program, you really see that these points kind of resemble the program from 1935 prepared by Twardowski. So probably he influenced, or he was influenced, or he influenced, we cannot say this today, the program. And as I said before, Domska also kind of finishes the discussion, and she speaks about the issue of teaching ethics, which is very contemporary issue again, because we still discuss whether we should teach ethics and whether we should include philosophy, or whether we should have philosophy classes and then teach ethics. So it's, as you can see, ongoing discussion. And the next one, please. Okay, so conclusions, I think I didn't, okay, they are here. Okay, so very quickly, I wanted to read you the conclusions because I didn't manage, unfortunately, because of the strain issue, to distinguish them so very quickly. The teaching of philosophical propadeutics, most often understood as the building of the logical and philosophical culture of society, became one of Kazimierz Twardowski's most important and long-standing philosophical goals. Both he and a large part of his students considered propadeutics to be one of the most important favors that philosophy can render to society. Hence, the observed persistence of interest in the problem extended over almost the entire period of Twardowski's academic activity. The discussions presented here are of a historical nature, as most of the specific issues addressed have lost their relevance today. This does not mean, however, that the main goals of propadeutics and the methods outlined here are a thing of the past. The more modern career of critical thinking in the United States and Canada has its roots in the concepts of John Dewey. It is striking that on many issues, Dewey and Twardowski see the role of scientific teaching and the need to educate it similarly. Of course, they differ in their philosophical traditions and in some of their detailed solutions. This is a topic for a separate study. However, the comparison shows that philosophical propadeutics in Poland had a strong pro-social and pro-development potential. The outbreak of World War II and totalitarian persecution largely destroyed that local tradition. But we think it can be rebuilt. We believe that it should be rebuilt and adapted to the needs of today. Maybe I think it's enough for the moment, so I will finish with these conclusions, and thank you very much for the presentation. And if you have any questions, I'm here to answer.
So are there any questions? Okay, if don't, then Ewelina, thank you very much. If any one of you has some questions that arise later, just message and I will be able to forward the question, and then the author himself, herself, or me will send you the answer, the author's answer. And for now, I just wanted to thank you for the participation. Please keep an eye on our social media, on our website, since we will be publishing the first issue. And the second one, containing the articles by Anna Brożek and by Ewelina Grądzka, will be published later. But still, I think you will like to read them once they are published. So if there are no questions, then thank you very much, and have a good evening, and see you later again at the next webinar.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.